And meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court has held in a series of cases, and now lower courts implementing those decisions, it basically said that many of the traditional constraints on judicial elections violate the First Amendment. And the argument has been, if we're going to have judicial elections, then we should have uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate for those offices, just as we do for executive and legislative positions. Now, if things get as bad as some of the pessimists suggest, then maybe there would be a push to change the system of choosing judges. But we have some history about trying to tinker with electing judges in this state, and there hasn't been a lot of support for cutting back on judicial elections.
You know, Ohio actually had an appointed judiciary for its first 49 years. The judges were appointed by the General Assembly. So not exactly what you think about when you think about an appointed judiciary. But since 1851, it's been an elected judiciary, and I'd just be very, very skeptical about the likely success of any effort to change that. And I think what you get from that, as the questioner suggested, is you get a lot of 4-3 votes and shifts going on. In the 1980s, the immunity decisions that were made suddenly opened, abrogated municipal and some sovereign immunity, and you had those decisions, decisions dealing with employee rights and insurance issues. There's a lot of technical stuff that lawyers, law professors see all the time, but a closely divided court will go back and forth. I guess what I would say, and maybe tying the judiciary issue to the larger theme of this program, and respecting and agreeing with Jonathan's point about the Supreme Court having interpreted people having a First Amendment right to spend money on elections, is that the best response to that, aside from maybe more money, is more sunlight, better disclosure. So with some of these initiative petitions, it's remained extremely difficult to figure out exactly where the money is coming from. Now, will that make a difference if the voters know that 98% of the money on this initiative or 87% of the money for that particular candidate is coming from out of state? And does that kind of broad disclosure somehow violate the right of people to donate in anonymity, which is arguably an element of the First Amendment? I'm not sure, but I can't come up with any way to limit the right of donors other than perhaps by creating more disclosure. And while I have some questions about whether an elected judiciary is the best way to get the most highly qualified people serving as judges, I'm not going to hold my breath in the hope that Ohio is going to change its policies.
Well, let me just make one other point about this. I mean, the argument about how you pick judges is ultimately a question about politics, writ large or small, as you will. I think that political culture has a lot to do with the kinds of judges you get, whether those judges are appointed or elected. It's hard to do systematic comparisons, but the people who support elected judiciaries say if you have an appointed judiciary, you just move the politics someplace else. And I think that there's something to be said for that. That doesn't necessarily answer the question, how do we pick them? But as we've been suggesting, Steve and I are law professors, and we probably are uncomfortable saying this out loud, but I think everybody understands that on a lot of important constitutional issues at both the state and the federal level, politics matters, because a lot of these questions are hard, and who you are, what your experiences are, what your values are, will influence the way you resolve hard questions. There's no way to take politics completely out of the picture. The question is whether there are ways to maintain some minimum level of dignity and decorum.
I had a more fundamental question about the initiative process. I always thought that direct democracy was a very dangerous thing because the electorate could be easily manipulated, could make rash decisions that are ill-informed, irresponsible. The ancient Athenians were manipulated by their demagogues that engaged in fiery rhetoric, swayed the masses, and now I think today our electorate could be swayed maybe not by demagogues but by well-funded advertising campaigns that lead to ill-informed decisions. And I was wondering what your opinion was on that.
Well, Madison thought the same thing, and that's why he tried to insulate the government that he originally supported from a lot of the mob rule. He wanted a representative democracy, and Jefferson seems to have taken the other view. And while Madison seems to have prevailed at the federal level, I mean, you look at the original Constitution, the people had a very small role in it. You look at just pick the Ohio Constitution because that's what we're talking about, there really was a very heavy role, including members of the Assembly who got reelected every year. Talk about short terms. But what you really raise, I think, is this big issue that continues today. To what extent do we have a representative democracy in which we encourage our representatives to be deliberative and careful, or to what extent do we want to take democracy into our own hands? Some of these devices for amending the Constitution have more deliberation in them. Others are more raw politics, such as the initiative. One of the critiques of the initiative is that it is not deliberative. Some have said, well, what you should do is have a double assent. You should make them go to the people twice so you can do more deliberating. But I don't know if anyone resolves the issue. Maybe Jonathan can.
Well, I don't know that I can resolve the issue, but I think that one of the standard critiques of the initiative is that there isn't room for deliberation. You vote the thing up or down, take it or leave it. And knowing that, folks who are pushing initiatives will try to get the proposal structured the way they want it. There's no meaningful opportunity to tinker with it. There's no real opportunity to tinker with it once the measure qualifies for the ballot. But again, I think we have to ask, and I'm not a big fan of initiatives either for reasons that you suggest, but it seems to me we ought to ask ourselves, compared to what? And anybody who looks at the way the legislative process works now, both in Columbus and in Washington, might ask, which part of the system is not broken? I think, again, we're talking political culture. We have bigger questions, I think, than how much we do by initiative and how much we do in the ordinary legislative process, because I don't think either one of those systems works terribly well.
But only 16 states have the direct initiative, and the other 34 have survived without it. But I think what's happened is that the initiative is part of our genetic makeup when it comes politically. It's been around here for 100 years, and if you tried to take the initiative away, right, I think people would go nuts. There was a proposal this past year in the General Assembly to increase the vote on initiated amendments, proposals that is, from 50% to 67%. It didn't really go any place, but it raised some interesting issues. I did a count, and it turned out that of the 17 amendments that were approved by the initiative process, only 3 of them would have been enacted had there been a 67% requirement. So it would have, in effect, killed the initiative as we know it. I think the best comment was made by someone right in the earlier days after the 1912 convention. They said they recognized that the initiative had not done all that its proponents wanted it to do, but it was sort of there to give the political system a rude jolt if it needs it from time to time.
Today at the City Club, we've been listening to a panel discussion on the Ohio Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Entin. Thank you, Mr. Steinglass. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This program is now adjourned.